The events that began last February that commemorate and celebrate the 250th anniversary of the start of the American Revolution, along with many other exciting events across the state, are sponsored by the Massachusetts Office of Travel and Tourism. They have been an incredible support for us this year and last year. It's part of the Mass 250 campaign. We are very grateful to be one of the communities chosen for the second year in a row to tell our revolutionary story. So the grant that sponsors this event, as I mentioned, is a partnership with Cushing House Maritime Museum, Lowell's Boat Shop, Newburyport, Chamber of Commerce, the North of Boston Convention and Visitors Bureau, Firehouse Center, Theater in the Open, all sorts of other community partners. So just a wonderful community-wide event. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Abby Schreiber, an award-winning public historian and curator at the National Museum of the United States Navy in Washington, D.C. Her areas of interest are early American material culture and economic history. Along with her colleagues, she's developing the Age of Sail Gallery for the new National Museum of the United States Navy. It is my pleasure to welcome you, so come on up on stage. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Schreiber.
A little bit like walking the plank, getting up the stairs there. Well, thank you everyone for being here today, and thanks for inviting me to speak here. I'm really looking forward to sharing with you some of my current research on the history of the Navy. Really can't see any of your faces at all. This is interesting because of the light. So, as Bethany mentioned, I'm one of the curators at the National Museum of the United States Navy, and I'm working on an Age of Sail Gallery narrative. So as we're developing a new museum, we're thinking about how we want to interpret these important stories of naval history. So, of course, as I'm thinking about the Age of Sail, you can probably guess I'm focusing on the War of 1812. But we are starting our story with the American Revolution because that is when we, the Navy, declare we were established. So as we're developing this narrative, our main takeaway that we want our visitors to walk away with is an answer to the question, why a Navy? Why does the Continental Congress think they need a Navy? Why does it become an imperative that there is a Navy later on? And so, kind of thinking about this question in the context of the American Revolution is a little fraught because it's not exactly a shining beacon of success and evidence for why a Navy should exist. But it does lay the groundwork for some of the contemporary conversations and debates that were going on that kind of shaped later debates and conversations and funding issues. So today I'm going to talk about a couple of frigates that were made here in Newburyport after kind of setting a little background information which builds off of earlier presentations, which were both very wonderful. So thank you for sharing your work with us. So, when we think about why a Navy in this period in the Revolution, immediately the argument against a Navy was, why bother, right? The Royal Navy was so overwhelming a force that there really wasn't a strong belief or realistic belief that anyone could at that time do enough to gather a force that could counter it. So, the Royal Navy had hundreds of vessels of all sizes. They had vessels that were larger than anything that was sailing around in the colonial waters here. And so, it was kind of this, David and Goliath doesn't even kind of begin to explain it, right? It was a very overwhelming match there. So the Royal Navy was working toward their goals of supporting the ground movements of troops, ferrying troops around, and disrupting continental shipping. And this was kind of going along with the mandate to enforce all of these different acts and changes in shipping procedures that Emily was talking about earlier. And so eventually, of course, they are mandated also to defeat enemy ships, which would include the Continental Navy. They were also charged with protecting island ports. So even though they had this sort of overwhelming naval force, they were spread kind of thin in certain areas. And so this is something that would work in the colony's favor, as they, had to take a lot of time to respond to different areas where they were needed. There's also a personnel problem, which is experienced by both sides. But even at the beginning of the Revolution, the Royal Navy was undermanned, and they were using impressment to get more sailors aboard their vessels. And of course, impressment was one of the major reasons that people legitimized, the call for independence, that American sailors shouldn't be subjected to service on British vessels because they were not British citizens. Of course, that becomes a much bigger issue for the War of 1812. Another kind of force that's, plying the waters in these days were the state navies, which were also referenced earlier. So 11 of the 13 colonies established their own naval force, mostly for the protection of the coastal waters and the inland waterways. So they weren't, in many cases, meant to be ocean-going. They weren't meant to take the fight to the enemy. They were meant to protect the home front. Some of them were very well organized, like Pennsylvania. They had committees and infrastructure, sort of bureaucracy set up to moderate and control those their small fleet. And then other colonies like New Hampshire only had a small handful or even one vessel. So they were kind of just organized to respond quickly to situations where they needed protection or needed to seize a prize vessel. The Massachusetts Navy, of course, had about 16 vessels over the course of the war, and they took about 70 prizes during that time. So in the Massachusetts case, all their ships were seagoing, but they mostly had small arms. So they weren't prepared to wage, major battles. They were prepared to kind of strike vulnerable ships. Another force that we've already talked about quite a lot, and will continue to, are the privateers. And these were private ships that were organized in order to, interrupt the enemy shipping, right? So these, at least in Massachusetts, were organized before the Continental Congress officially announced Declaration of Independence, and so they kind of used a legal loophole to legitimize their actions. They didn't want to be seen as official rebels, like by the letter of the law. So they were kind of saying that they were acting against they were acting against the British Parliament, which had, in their argument, had gone rogue, and they were still loyal to the king. Of course, that argument ceased to matter once the Declaration of Independence was formally made and everyone was in a state of rebellion. So these privately owned vessels were, were just, for the most part, at the beginning of the war at least, they were vessels that were already around. In many cases, already had crews, they already had captains. But they still needed supplies and weapons and things like that. So it's not that they were immediately ready to, jump to defense or strike, but they were more readily available than any, major fleet from a continental perspective. So, we already talked about the numbers and successes of the privateers, so I'm not going to go into that too much. But they did have a lot of successes, and they were very crucial to resupply efforts. So, as I'll talk about in a few minutes, the want of supplies was a really big problem for the Continental Navy. And so the privateers were really helping them to find and access all these different supplies that they needed. They also created a lot of political pressure and diplomatic pressure in this context, where British shipping was being so interrupted at certain times that it was becoming sort of tipping the scales, in favor of the cessation of a war and kind of letting the colonies go. So this is the rattlesnake model that we have in our collection at the museum. This was designed in 1779 by John Peck of Boston, and it was built in Plymouth in the style of a miniature frigate. So it could have up to 20 guns and a complement of 85 men. It was known to be a fast ship, but there isn't that much known about its actual actions during the war, except that it was eventually captured in 1781 and sold off after that. So another sort of fleet that is in play in this period is Washington's Navy, which is one that has come up briefly but not been talked about to a great degree yet. So George Washington had his army around Boston right at the beginning of the war. And, he immediately knew and understood that he had needs as far as defense and offensive measures. He could see that there were smaller British vessels sailing around Boston and the Massachusetts coast, that were vulnerable and carried a lot of supplies. So he began to write out, we might call them letters of marque, but I don't think they technically are letters of marque, but basically making authorizations to Army officers to man vessels and then use them in the fight against the British. So this is sort of an ad hoc naval force, if you will. So these were mostly authorized in the fall of 1775, and they were used to protect different ports, gather supplies, and take offensive action against enemy supply vessels. So besides the Army personnel, there are also Marines that were on some of these ships, and their details were usually very short, so they weren't being signed onto this detail for years or anything. It was usually just a few weeks. So many of the ships that were part of this had multiple captains, even though they were only in service for a year or two at the very most. This document on the screen is from the Harrison, which was one of the vessels in this fleet. So from the Navy Museum perspective, this is actually one of our very prized possessions because it is signed by George Washington. So of course, we all love that. This was signed on October 22nd, 1775, and addressed to Captain William Coit. So the Harrison was lightly armed. It only had 4 4-pounders and 6 swivel guns, which is a very small armament for a vessel that might be engaging in, a battle scenario. Coit and his crew were charged with aiding in the defense of Boston. They were given instructions to capture, that if they captured any prize, they were to search diligently for any intelligence, like papers, maps, or instructions that might help Washington understand what was going on. And then if they took any cargo, that they had to take it to an agent to be sold and distributed to the Army, and that all of the crew could receive a part of the prize. So they would get a third of the prize value to be split up among the crew. And again, it was the same type of shares that Emily talked about earlier with privateers, except for because these sailors, or soldiers really, were being paid by the Army, they got fewer shares. So they get a third of the prize cargo. I think the captain got 6 shares, and then it just went down from there. So it was not as lucrative a proposition as privateering, but they did kind of get this, well, they were supposed to get a regular salary from the Army as well. In this case, for the Harrison, again, because it was so lightly armed, they were discouraged from engaging with any warships, but there's kind of a phrase in there that's like, use your best judgment, don't do anything stupid, but also don't be a coward kind of stuff. And they were also warned to be very careful of their ammunition. And he points out specifically, don't waste it in needless salutes. So even at this early stage, October 1775, they're already really worried about supplies of ammunition, especially for big guns. So Harrison sailed from Plymouth to Boston, where Coit captured 4 British prizes. 2 of them were supply ships. So, this is exactly what he was supposed to be doing, and, would be counted as a success. After a sort of long and frozen winter, Harrison was in pretty bad shape. So it was decommissioned and sold. All of the other vessels in Washington's Navy were either returned to their owners or captured by the end of 1777. So again, this was a very short-lived fleet and very small, and really just meant to be responsive in the absence of a sort of actual Navy that could be controlled from the Continental Congress level. So, that kind of process proved to some people in the Continental Congress that there was a need for a Navy, that the Continental Congress should have vessels at its own disposal that it could order around and, decide where and what it should be doing. So by December 13th, 1775, the Continental Congress was authorizing the construction of 13 frigates. Even before they start authorizing these frigates to be built, though, they're already leasing, buying, borrowing, seizing other vessels to be used as the Continental Navy. So it's not that these are just 13 ships that are on the, in the Continental Navy. There's many more ships. They're just not purpose-built for the Continental Navy. So when the Congress decides to enact this legislation, they distribute across all the different colonies that ships will be built in different ports. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is to kind of spread out the supply network. So, instead of having 13 frigates building in all one place where it would overwhelm the supply chain there, they've got them kind of spread out all down, up and down the coast. It also kind of spreads out the military targets, right? So that they're not all kind of sitting there being built at the same time in the same place where they could be easily attacked or vulnerable. They're in many different places, and even if some of them are lost while on the stocks, it's not a complete disaster for the whole enterprise. There's also a certain amount of, sorry, I got ahead of myself. So whilst in practice, supplying and outfitting these militaries was known to be a profitable enterprise. People, even earlier in the 18th century, were seeking these positions of agents, commissaries, these roles where they were buying and selling supplies for the military. Many merchants in the colonies made a lot of money doing that during the 7 Years' War, just a decade before this. So, there's an awareness of how profitable this process can be, and also wanting to kind of spread out the sort of wealth in that case. There's also, an element of politicking here, that spreading out all these different commissions for building the ships allows members of the Congress who maybe are more skeptical about a sort of national navy to say, like, well, we're going to get a piece of this pie too, so, it'll be an opportunity for us as well. So as coming out of that, there's sort of this sense of competition, which we'll see related to Massachusetts. Each colony kind of pushing to be first, pushing to be the best, pushing to be, the most well-fitted out ship. And so, there's this kind of, you might say, petty competition, but it kind of spurs on some of these projects. So as I said, Congress was already buying, leasing, and stealing legally ships to use for their own purposes. Abraham Whipple was his first Continental Navy assignment was as captain of Columbus in December 1775, which had previously been a merchant ship and was overhauled to put to use as a naval frigate. So we already have naval personnel, in office, so to speak. They're already, being commissioned as officers. There's already sailors, who are working for the Continental Navy before the frigates are finished and sailing. So if I go back to my beginning here, talking about why a Navy, one of the rich sources of the development of the Navy in the American Revolution is the sort of establishment of the naval bureaucracy, which I know sounds a little boring, but is important because it shows how they're kind of learning to lead this organization that becomes this massive enterprise. So right away, once the Congress decides, we should have a Navy, a force that we can take and protect our waters or protect our vessels outside of our, immediate coastline. They have to set up a bureaucracy to run that organization. And of course, much of what they do is based off of what they knew from being English subjects. So it very closely mirrors, what the setup was for the Royal Navy. And then the interesting part I referenced earlier is that by the time we get to the War of 1812, we start to see, this sort of like American spice on it, that they're making their own way, they're making their own decisions about, this worked in the English context, but it's not working for us, so we should do something different. So we see formation of committees in the Continental Congress, establishment of a chain of command, ranking of officers. They publish rules for the regulation of the Navy and for the sailors, and then they start formally recruiting sailors. We also see, pay scales being established, and a lot of this, again, mirrors what the Royal Navy was doing, partially because that's what everyone knew and what they expected. So, everyday men who wanted to sign up to do something in the American Revolution, right, are faced with this choice of privateer, Continental Navy, join the Army, so they're making it sort of like what people will expect, so that they're comfortable and feel like they will get what they're promised. As this kind of develops, what we see is that many of the captains and crew members were also serving on privateers. So there's, during the American Revolution, this really interesting it's not a pattern, it's just kind of random, but people are serving on privateers, then they join the Navy for a little while, and then they go back to privateers, and then they go on to something else. So there's not this there's not really in practice, situation where people join the Navy and then that's it. They're in the Navy for life. It's very much seen as a temporary situation. And as I mentioned before, people serving in the Navy did have the opportunity to earn prizes when they captured vessels, but they were usually a smaller amount than what the privateers could expect to get. But again, they have their wages to rely on as well. So this document is from later on in the war, right at the end actually, prize money accounting from The Hague. And this was from Lieutenant Michael Neese. He was actually in the Navy for a few years before this document was written. He enlisted in like 1778. He'd been an officer. He was a third lieutenant by the time he was serving on this vessel. And he had actually been involved in some interesting quarreling with a previous captain who claimed that, so Neese was the officer on watch, so he was supposed to be ready for the captain to come aboard, and the captain came to the ship, and there was no one waiting for him to help him get back up on the ship, right? So the captain berated him loudly in front of the rest of the crew, and Lieutenant Neese didn't like that or appreciate it because he says he didn't know the captain was coming. No one told him, so how could he be blamed for that? So they actually got into a really big fight about this, and it ended up getting into a court-martial situation, which ended up getting canceled by Robert Morris, who was a friend of the captain and didn't like that the court-martial came out in Neese's favor. So there's, talk about the beginnings of regulation here. Robert Morris just overrode all of this, bureaucracy put in place to adjudicate things because he didn't like the outcome. But after that experience, a new captain came to town. This is, John Manley is the captain on Hague at this time. And they captured several prizes, and this is an accounting of Neese's share of the prizes that are going to be paid out to his widow when the ship comes back to port. So he died in 1783 before the ship finished its journey. So once we get to the actual building of the frigates, it's kind of an interesting process in Newburyport because they're, in some ways, they're ready to go, right? There's an active shipbuilding industry here. There are supplies at hand to build boats. But then, there's already shortages. There's already staffing problems. So it's kind of interesting to see how those things change as the progress of building the ship is made. So the frigates were authorized in mid-December of 1775. And right away, Thomas Cushing is sent to Newburyport. He's from Massachusetts. He was a merchant and politician. And he was given the position of Commissioner of Marine Affairs. So they were supposed to build two ships, one of 24 guns and one of 32. He thought that Newburyport would be a, quote, convenient and safe place to build. So he met with Stephen and Ralph Cross in January of 1776. They were local shipbuilders to talk about the logistics and likelihood of them being able to complete this project. And they brought on Jonathan Greenleaf, who is another local shipbuilder. So the three would build the frigates as a partnership, and they felt very confident that they could get things going quickly and make good progress. Even at this early stage, Cushing already had hemp and duck, so those are things needed for ropes and sails. He'd already purchased coal. So again, this is just like a couple of weeks after they authorized these. He bought coal from Thomas Mifflin in Philadelphia, and he expected to get the best price for iron there as well. One of the Cross shipbuilders warned him that the timbers would be very large and expensive, and that he would need 1/3 of the builder's fee up front to pay for those materials. That was about 2,000 pounds. So Cushing is constantly writing back to John Hancock in the Continental Congress saying, can you please send me money? I need more money. Can you open an account for me? Is there any money? So they end up spending tens of thousands of pounds building these ships. Cushing was as I said, writing to John Hancock, who was at the time the president of the Continental Congress and chair of the Marine Committee. So that's why he was corresponding mostly with him. They're also kind of personal friends. And they still, even though they were already gathering supplies and had engaged builders, they didn't have yet plans for the ship or a hull model, half-hull model to use as the basis of the design. So things are moving, but there's also this wait for these other materials that are needed. So regionally, as I said, there's a supply chain in place that's allowing these shipbuilders to get a hold of things because they already have established, where they're going to get lots of different materials from. And they can stretch out across the region. They're getting things from Philadelphia and even Maryland in some cases. They have this kind of pre-existing competition and confidence around being part of Massachusetts, and that there's this kind of regional craft aspect to it that Hancock is actually worried about when he writes back to Thomas Cushing. Hancock is worried that people are going to denigrate Massachusetts shipbuilding abilities if they don't do this right and well. So on March 6, 1776, again, this is just 3 months after these were authorized, he writes, quote, "The ships are going on with the utmost dispatch." So John Hancock urges Cushing to push the work forward with everything he has to spare no expense. Quote, "I must most earnestly entreat and beg of you that you exert every nerve in forwarding our 2 ships, and that you employ as many men in every department as can possibly work and be of service in expediting them. In short, spare no expense in forwarding them. For between us," he says, "some here who are not very friendly to you and I, and of our province, you know who, began publicly to say that the Massachusetts ships will be the last finished, that they are in no forwardness," which means they're not making progress, and so on. "I want to counteract them, in order to which you must exert yourself, and I must repeat to you that no emolument to any particular person must prevent the ordering as many people as can possibly attend. Dispatch and not profit is the object, and pray attend to this night and day." So Hancock is, not mincing words here. He's saying, we have a reputation to protect, and we must get this done quickly, effectively, and at any cost. So Hancock's sending out all kinds of details about, how to spend money, how much money there is to spend, and different articles that they've already purchased. So Hancock is kind of in the background helping to get things that aren't immediately available here in Newburyport. He's sending on estimates for cables, anchors, and other supplies, generally for the size of the ship. Again, they still don't have plans exactly for the ship at this point, so this is in March. So he didn't have the official dimensions for the rigging, but he instructed Cushing to move ahead with all haste and to use his best judgment if they could not wait for further orders. So there's some tension there as far as what exactly do they want this ship to look like or be like versus the expediency of the project. Cushing received some supplies from war prizes, including hemp and anchors, and that comes up several times in their letters that they are, fortuitously getting some supplies that they were in need of, or that they maybe could get cheaper from a prize instead of buying it through their typical supply chain. So in May, they laid the upper deck of the smaller frigate, which would become the Boston, and the larger one, which will become Hancock, did not yet have the lower deck beams. So we're in May. That's about 5.5 months since they were ordered to be made. They are making pretty good progress. Military supplies were probably the most worrisome part of the letters, that they're all very worried about having guns, gunpowder, small arms, ammunition, even, as I mentioned before, George Washington was worried about that, before they even commissioned the frigates. So in February 1776, Cushing thought he could get the heavy guns cast by Aaron Hobart of Abington, which is south of Boston. You all probably know that. I had to look it up. But the pig iron, or the immediate iron material for the gun manufacture, would come from Philadelphia. So he also knew he could try to rely on the Providence furnace, but he already knew that Providence had promised all of their guns to the Rhode Island Navy. So, there's this, all these different fleets acting, ideally together, but also trying to get supplies from the same places and causing problems. And one of those problems being cost increases. We'll see as we go on that the Continental Congress is starting to say, whoa, how much do they want for iron? It gets a little out of hand. So any prize capture that had guns or ammunition, those were being filtered toward the Army, but Cushing was there in order to get those things from the ships and claim them for Boston and Hancock, the ships. So gunpowder was another big problem, and this was a supply and manufacture problem because there weren't a lot of places making gunpowder in the colonies, so they really had to rely on imported gunpowder. So I pulled a few objects from our collection that show you what they were using the gunpowder for, but I'm sure you guys can imagine that without this. So besides the military supplies, personnel was another big problem. Again, it's this competition. If you're an able-bodied man standing around in Newburyport in 1776, you've got so many choices of what you could do with yourself, and privateering is seen by most people as the most likely prospect for profits, personal profits. So people are motivated by all kinds of different things, though, right? Even though privateering is profitable, it also is pretty risky. So maybe something else seems less risky to certain people. In February 1776, the Massachusetts Council sought help procuring a crew of 50 men, which in Newburyport they answered that all available men had joined the Army or were privateers. So at the end of March 1776, Newburyport could not sign on crew for the state Navy ships. In fact, they didn't even have enough crew to sail the vessel to another port to pick up additional sailors. So they're very short. This continued through April. And another problem with the naval vessels, at least, was that since they couldn't procure guns, they were having trouble signing men on because men wouldn't sign on to ships that didn't have guns guaranteed. It's obvious why. So that was a big problem, the sort of intersection of those two shortages. As the ships were progressing, they started to talk about officers. And April 17, 1776, Continental Congress elected John Manley and Isaac Casno as captains of the two frigates. Casno, though, did not end up signing on. It was instead Hector McNeil who was advanced in his place, and his commission came through later in June. So John Manley is kind of a well-known privateer. He was born in England, but settled in Marblehead as a merchant captain. He was also a captain in George Washington's fleet and had kind of made a name for himself there. He won a lot of really important prizes, someone wrote a song about him. He was so well-liked locally. So there was a popular British song that someone had made into a song called Washington, which was a song about George Washington. And then someone locally here in Massachusetts rewrote the song and wrote it about John Manley. So, he's the George Washington of the Navy, locally at least. Hector McNeil, the other captain, was Irish, and his parents had moved to Boston when he was a child. So he also had captained ships. He was active in the British Merchant Marine and lived in Quebec, actually, when the Revolution broke out. He chose the American side and then asked Congress for an officer's commission in the Navy, which he received in June of 1776. Interestingly, Manley and McNeil did not like each other. They had some conflict, which ended up creating a real problem for them operationally. So by April 27th, Hancock directed Cushing to communicate with the elected captains and make a list of good men to serve in all the other officer positions. So sometimes the captains would have men in mind to serve as their officers, and sometimes they would kind of recruit from locally available people. In June, on June 3rd, they launched Boston. So there's a quote from a local newspaper: "In the view of a great number of spectators, she is highly approved of by all who are judges of a very fine ship. She is built with the very best of timber, and the workmanship is complete," meaning it's well done and of high quality. So they're launching the ship, but they still don't have a crew, they still don't have guns. June 24th, Cushing says Boston could sail in a fortnight if she had a crew, guns, and oh, by the way, where is Captain McNeil and First Lieutenant Brown? They're not even around yet because they'd just been commissioned two weeks before that. Not even 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks. So, there's, again, this wait and hope things turn out well. Hancock was launched in July and also waited for orders for the crew and supplies of guns. The crew problem is very acute at this time. There's a quote that says, "We are almost drained of all our men," in this local area. So a real problem. Such a big problem, it actually takes a year to gather all these supplies and men. The two ships sail out together in May 21st of 1777. And right away, they engage with an enemy vessel, and they capture a prize Fox on June 8th. However, as they're sailing back, they are approached by a bigger British vessel, and McNeil, sailing the Boston, sails away from the engagement and kind of hides in Maine. And Hancock is chased for 39 hours, but eventually is captured along with the prize. So that outcome is kind of the consequence of the two captains not getting along with each other very well. McNeil was not willing to aid Manley in that situation. So Emily, I think, mentioned British captains commissioning pictures, and that's exactly what this is. So the Hancock is sailing out of the frame, and then Boston is pictured there. Oh, I have a pointer. This is Boston and Hancock. And then Fox, the prize, is right behind them. Okay, so Hancock was taken as a prize on July 8th, 1777. We do have in our collection a modern artistic rendering of the Hancock. This is not from the time period. So Manley was put in prison. He was put on one of the prison ships in New York Harbor. As an officer, he would have received a slightly better treatment than the average sailor, but again, the conditions were poor, so it wasn't, a wonderful experience. But he was able to get exchanged out in March of 1778. Manley and McNeil were actually court-martialed over the outcome of this engagement, and Manley was acquitted of any wrongdoing, but McNeil was dismissed from the Navy because of his actions. So Manley went back to privateering, and then he later came back to the Navy to command Hague. So going back to that prize account I talked about earlier, that was from his Navy vessel. And then McNeil also went to privateering for Massachusetts. So they both stayed, working on the seas during the Revolution, but in different capacities. So Boston went on to serve in more engagements and delivered John Adams to France for diplomatic purposes. And the captain during that voyage, who replaced McNeil, was Samuel Tucker. We actually have a really interesting collection of objects related to Samuel Tucker. So he was born in Marblehead and was a merchant captain before the war. He was in command of part of Washington's Navy around Boston, and he proved himself to be a competent captain and got a lot of prizes off the coast of Massachusetts. So this commission was kind of a recognition of all of the good work that he had done and was doing, and kind of reflected the esteem that he had in, we'll say, naval circles at this time. So the objects here are a prayer book, a quadrant, and a spyglass, which is broken. So that's actually in conservation currently to hopefully be put on display in the new museum someday as one piece. So then the Boston continued to get many prizes and remained in service until it was sent to Charleston in 1780, where it was lost during that siege. And the men were all arrested, but Tucker was able to trade himself out very quickly. So the story of the Continental frigates is, not a very glorious one at the end of the Revolution. By the time things are all said and done, almost all of them have been lost, sold. Many of them sold almost immediately after being finished or seized. There's only one frigate that's still sailing at the official end of the war alliance. So it's not, not a resounding, this is why we need a Navy, right? It's kind of a sad moment in our naval history because there's a popular opinion and a reality that a Navy is too expensive. The high cost of maintaining, manning, supplying all these vessels is overwhelming for a small government. And there's still an ongoing debate at this time about how big, the federal government is going to be, how much it can actually collect in taxes, and how that money can be used to support things like a Navy or a standing army. The privateers made a big impact, of course. Definitely a lot more prizes from privateers than there were from naval vessels. But in the sort of this, if you think of this time period as the germ of our United States Navy, we do see, some significance. We see utility, and we see a sort of emerging naval culture that will carry on and be reestablished once it's obvious again in 1794 that, yes, in fact, if we want to be a commercial empire and have our vessels sailing in other nations' waters, we do need to have a Navy to protect them. So thank you for your attention today, and I'm happy to take any questions if you have any. Yeah, I can't see anyone, so. Oh, someone over here.
So every summer I drive up towards Lake George and I go to a town called Whitehall. There seems to be, I guess it's based on Confederate or Continental versus after the war, the U.S. right?
Mm-hmm.
But do you have any thoughts on, and Marblehead and Beverly also seem to think they're the beginnings of the Navy?
I'm aware of an ongoing debate on that subject. I'm not prepared to make a formal statement at this time.
Well said. There's a question right behind the wall.
Well, I was going to say, the U.S. who claimed that the real birthday of the Navy is in Philadelphia, right? When the Continental Congress, so that kind of puts paid to the whole thing about Beverly Martin. And also, very well, I'm explaining that it's a very provisional, ad hoc operation that Washington had a short term. It seems an awful stretch for either Beverly or Marblehead to claim really the birthplace of the Navy.
Well, you're going to get out of here before anybody quarters the
Oh, sorry. The question was Beverly and Marblehead debate on whether they were the first origin of the Navy, and what is my answer to that debate?
Question back there?
Yeah.
Will you be telling any stories about the alliance in your museum?
The question was, will we be telling any stories about the Alliance in our museum, and would I like to see where it was built? Yes, I would, and yes, we will. So that's, does that answer your question? I would like to.
It's the same river. It's just around the bend.
Okay, great.
Any other questions? What's the completion date for the museum?
The question was, do we have a completion date for the museum, which is a very good question. Right now, we're in a bit of a planning phase because we don't have a site currently officially. So, no, we have to have a site first. But we are developing gallery plans for the museum. So we're going through a process of visioning. Let me say that again, visioning, where we're kind of putting out like what we hope we can talk about in a generic amount of space. So, we're saying, let's say the museum is 100,000 square feet. Let's say we have 20% of that dedicated to historical galleries. That's not the actual number. Don't quote me on that. So just last week, actually, we went over age of sale and talked about, if we have, I think, 6,000 square feet to talk about age of sale, what stories are we going to tell? What do we want people to walk away with when they leave the gallery? And what kind of feelings or moods do we want to project in that space? So that's kind of where we are with planning the museum. And this is kind of a standard procedure for projects of this scale where you're starting out with all new. So it's an exciting time to be a curator at the National Museum, but also a little uncertain because we don't know right now.
How did Massachusetts do relative to the other colonies in terms of completing the commissions to build the ships? Like, did Massachusetts actually come out, finish the ships, more quickly than the other colonies?
That's a really great question. She asked, did Massachusetts actually finish theirs first? No, I think there was one before. I can't remember what colony it was from. Someone here knows. Okay. We're gonna get in a colonial war in here. I love it. But they did go pretty fast. But then there's the question of, when they finished the ship versus when it actually entered into action, which was a long pause. They didn't face anything that was unique in that situation either. Everyone was having the same constraints.
Thank you so much once again. Thank you so much.